that tradition has used. The tradition, has used to call dualistic, but which I prefer to define as polar for the moment, from poles. We find unequivocal signs of these polarities at the epistemological, ontological, cosmological, psychological, ethical, political spheres throughout the entire Platonic corpus. However, I think the time may have come to acknowledge that in Plato one can find the postulation of two realms, of two levels, yes, but of a one and same reality. Two ontological levels that are quite different in terms of value, in terms of importance, but somehow they are connected and relatively interdependent, on one another. Thus, the initial question I proposed in the title, whether Plato was a dualist, could be then reformulated right from the beginning of the paper. To what extent was Plato a dualist? How far indeed would Plato have been willing to defend a separation between two worlds, or a separation between body and soul? So the general argument I want to put forward is that a definitive separation between polarities, the one that would correspond to a radical version of the two-world theory or of a strong dualistic separation of body and soul, is something that Plato himself would probably consider quite uninteresting in some way, because this contradicts the very fundamental intuition, the horizon of meaning, both the origin of the hypothesis of the two-world, its functions, the two-world theory, its function, its necessity is of a critical foundation, not of alternative from an epistemological, ontological, or even existential alternative, as in the case of the soul. This means that if we stop to think about the genesis of the hypothesis and the necessity to postulate the two worlds, I think it's rather clear that a clean separation between what I'm now calling the two polarities does not fit into the Platonic project. If it's true that the asymmetrical duality of the two levels would subsequently lead to dualistic readings throughout the history of philosophy, of course, Plato seems to be more focused on the mediation, on the intermediary, the metaxou lexicon. In Plato, there is a tension that is directed from a strong, very far from a strong dualistic reading, exactly to the overcoming of the separation by emphasizing his opposite, I mean the relationship. This is evident even from a lexical point of view. Plato in the corpus uses scarcely the dualistic vocabulary of parousia, present, or chorismos, separation. We can count them 22 for parousia and only 9 times for chorismos. On the contrary, the lexicon of participation is very present. Here we have turned from the root of the verb metalambanen, metechin, which appears 60 times, and especially the term koinonia, which pop-ups more than 200 times in a frankly well-distributed fashion throughout the entire corpus. Obviously, in these terms plays a central role the suffix meta, which indicates the being together, being in the middle, as you well know, central conceptual figures of the relationship between the alleged two worlds. The same lexicon we are going to find in the pages of the Phaedo that we will further address. So in this Platonic scheme, the soul has a double value, ethical and cognitive, becoming, I think, the central figure and driving force for all the Platonic efforts to put the two worlds in relation. The soul is always in a permanent up and down movement, wanting to connect, wanting to put in relationship. You can think about the Scala Amoris in the Symposium, for example, the cave in the Republics, of course, the Phaedrus myth we heard about yesterday. I think we will see a good example of this same mobility in order to connect thereafter in this in my paper. So, within this general frame, I decided to now address the problem of the separation of body and soul in Plato's Phaedo, in search of both its ontological feature and its moral consequence. Apart from the normal approach and the use of a dialogue as a literary and philosophical milestone for all body-soul dualism throughout the history of philosophy, I believe two different ways of understanding the separation are outlined on the dialogue. The first one will indicate a moral separation regarding what the philosopher should take care of. So philosophers are supposed to mind the soul and not the body. There are several pages within the dialogue, Plato, the Phaedo, in which this thesis, widely taken up by the tradition, is mentioned. It will be sufficient to have a look at the first page of the dialogue, where this issue is raised to give a glimpse of the moral extent of the idea of the separation of body and soul. So Simmias starts, so Socrates saying, do we believe that there is such a thing as death? Can we believe there is anything other than the separation of the soul from the body? And do we believe that being dead is the following: the body has been separated from the soul and come to be apart, alone by itself, and the soul has been separated from the body and is apart, alone by itself? Can death be anything other than that? Consider that, my friend, if you too turn out to think what I do, I believe that the following points will give us a better understanding of the things we are looking into. Does it seem to you in character for a philosophical man to be eager for such so-called pleasures as those of food and drink, and so on? And then I will finally show you what I wanted to comment on. In short, then, say Socrates, do you think that such a man's concern is not for the body, and then, as far as he can, he stands apart from it and is turned toward his soul? So first of all, is it clear that it matters, like this philosopher releases his soul as much as possible from its association with the body, he above all other people? And ordinary people think, don't they, Simmias, that life isn't worth living for someone who finds nothing of that kind pleasant and who takes no interest in bodily things. They think that he who gives no thought to the pleasure which comes via the body is pretty close to being dead. And of course, yes, this is quite true. So the first meaning of the separation, the moral one, regards a philosopher who gives no thought to the body and turns himself toward his soul. This separation, operated by those who particularly disdain the body and live in philosophy, as it said in 68c, is that being pretty close to being dead, because of course death is nothing other than this separation between body and soul. I can mention here that, for example, Wolff proposed a third and very sharp distinction between a weaker evaluative, is called dualism, and the stronger ascetic reading of the separation. I also want to mention Pakaluk's idea that sees a kind of maximization of the death as core concern of the philosophical life. The philosopher aims to be as dead as possible while alive. It's a very interesting idea on this moral dualism. A second way to address this separation, however, between body and soul is the one I would call an ontological separation. The soul is so independent from the body that is declared to survive after its death. Again, it is worth remembering here one of the several pages dedicated to the proof and the myths of the immortality of the soul. I'll choose the final argument, not because the argument is regarded by Plato as conclusive, or by Socrates as conclusive, as pace frede, but because it seemed to finally undermine the considerable criticism of Simmias and Cebes, and to reach some kind of consent from that. And this is the next slide. So, because the immortal is also indestructible, surely soul, if it's really immortal, would also be imperishable, wouldn't it? In that case, when death attacks the human being, the mortal part of him dies, it seems, whereas the immortal part departs intact and undestroyed and is gone, having retrieved from death. Although both concepts of the separation could seem pretty familiar due to the success they had throughout the history of Platonism until today, the duplicity of the meaning expressed by the Platonic pages carries on an irrevocable ambiguity. This ambiguity has been usually resolved, admitting that the moral dualism would be just a kind of an anticipated homicide of the body, as condition sine qua non for a full and successful practice of philosophy. The same lecture happens to be suggested by Socrates himself while he's taking the separation of the soul from the body as teknanai meletosa radius in 81a, practice to die easily. We can see here a process of simple conformation of the philosopher to the inevitable ontological reality of the dualism. The huge success of this moral conformation of the philosopher in the history of Western thoughts allows Monique Dissot to write claims that the Plato, and I'm translating myself, is the text of all that had allowed the substitution of Platonism to the dialogue. For it is agreed that here one can find the complete formulation of the theory of the ideas and the most radical expression of Plato's asceticism, and even, before the letter, of his Christianism. But to what extent this ontological separation actually goes, I mean, how strong should be regarded the body-soul dualism in Plato's Phaedo, is an endless, unresolved debate. It is not my aim here to offer an account of the ongoing discussion between the scholar who think that Plato in the Phaedo is a strong dualist and the ones that think that this dualism should be taken with a grain of salt. I will simply assume two undemonstrated but well-referred starting point. The first one is that Plato dualism is far from being a strong substance dualism, like the one we are used to after Descartes, for example. And the second one is that Plato's idea of an independent existence of the soul apart from the body, which would represent the stronger dualistic approach, is not a definitive one, not a coherent theory one can find in Plato's writings. Carone, or Caron, I don't know, is right in claiming that Plato kept an open mind as to whether the soul is something immaterial or not, in a way that makes later historical transition, such as the theories of Aristotle or the Stoics, for instance, they are far less abrupt than one might think. I will say that at the same time, I will distance myself from Carone because she claims that Plato, in these later dialogues, would have left behind the strong dualistic commitments of the Phaedo by allowing that the mind may be the subject of spatial movements. Of course, she's thinking about the Timaeus. I believe some kind of indecision and nuances on his dualistic approach can be seen right from the beginning, right from Phaedo itself, or from at least the middle dialogues. We don't have to jump, I would say, to the Timaeus to find this. What I suggest here, therefore, is a quite different solution for the ambiguity between moral and ontological dualism. My suggestion is that we should pay the proper attention to the ontological and epistemological ductility, plasticity of the soul. Bostock called it the chameleon-like traits, chameleon-like traits of the soul, enabling the soul to assume bodily features to meet the sensible world. The central page here is 79c, and I'll devote my next minutes more closely to it. We can find the page inside what has been called the argument from affinity. The argument starts from the statement of a substantial difference between sensible and intelligible dimensions. This difference depends on the attributes of the mutability, identity, simplicity, and consequently visibility, while the sensible world and the body within it is non-identical to itself, hence changeable. On its side, intelligible reality, to which the soul is similar, is always identical to itself, auto kat auto. Hence, it is unchangeable. Reality in itself, which means the forms, το ίζον, το καλόν, το εκαστόν εστίν, does not admit any possibility of metabole, of change. While tapola kala, the plurality of the beautiful things, human beings, horses, clothes, will never be identical to themselves, or each one to the other. At this point, Socrates' arguments give a step forward, introducing the issue of visibility, and this is the next slide. Now, is it true that this you could touch, see, and perceive with the other senses, but that when it comes to those that stay identical, you could never get hold of them with anything other than the reasoning of your thought, such thing being unseen and not visible? In this case, Socrates' reasoning is going forward. We should very likely admit the existence of two different genres or classes, eide, of things that are to men oraton, to the ide, the visible and the invisible ones. Once Socrates leads the interlocutor to admit, starting from the simple existence of invisible thing, that something like a genre, a dose of the invisible actually exists, it's easy for him to take the argument to the conclusion, playing a double checkmate to the interlocutor. The first one is Socrates is now able to ascribe to the eidos, or the invisible, what had previously held of the invisible things, which means what is invisible is unchangeable, always identical to itself. And the second checkmate, that is now in the position to claim that of the two constituent parts of the individual, the body is homoioteros, more akin to the visible, while the soul is more akin to the invisible. I think here is important to note that the word eidos doesn't have in the page now, that's now under discussion, the technical meaning of the idea / form, of course. This connotation of the word is going to play an important role later on in the dialogue. And that's why some of the commentators, and I agree with them, they really see here the beginning of the theory of the forms, because you can see the language is still a bit shaky, uncertain. The lexicon is not established yet. And a second remark is that Fierro, our friend Freya, I hope she's here, I can see her, rightly points out that the comparative homoioteron here, along with the superlative homoiotatot, it also happens to pop up in the text, reveals that the ontological difference between the soul and the body is more attenuated than the other between the intelligible and the sensible realms. And my friend Gianni Casertano follows a similar line of thought when he says that this comparative homoioteron leads logically to the fact that the soul is not the invisible, but it is more invisible than the body. And that the body is also similar to the invisible, but less invisible than the soul. I think these are very important and sensitive remarks from both Fierro and Casertano. It is also noteworthy that this argument from affinity doesn't generally enjoy much respect from the scholarship. According to Apolloni, for example, the lack of sympathy and enthusiasm for this argument is not difficult to understand. In fact, it says, the main thrust of this chain of argument is clearly very weak. That the soul is more similar to the form than it is to the bodies does not establish how it is similar. And so it falls short of showing that it is similar in that both the soul and the form are indestructible or indissoluble. If the conclusion leaves open the possibility that the soul is nearly indestructible, I'm following Apollonian argument, then it is destructible after all, in which case the argument falls short of establishing what it was supposed to establish. Elton sees in the argument an object lesson in how not to do good philosophy. They are quite harsh against our beloved Plato. Daughter roundly claims that the argument is clearly not intended to be a rigorous one. And I must say, and it's kind of a joke from my part, a similar complaint has been filed by my friend Franco Trabattoni also, when Socrates says that the soul is akin to the invisible because only the forms are really invisible. The argument is fatally undermined, claims Trabattoni. Only the invisible itself is unchangeable and indestructible, not something which, like the soul, which is simply akin to it. Even Bostock considers the argument built on this shaky likeness is exactly somewhat shaky. Actually, this complaint is not new. We can find it filed by Porphyry himself, by Porphyry contra Boethus. The text is preserved in Eusebius of Caesarea's Preparatio Evangelica, and Eusebius, immediately after quoting a generous big passage of Socrates' argument from the Affinity, refers to Porphyry's explanation of the correct meaning of the passage. Eusebius' polemic here is clearly directed against Boethus' criticism of the weakness of the arguments. Unfortunately, this criticism and the text has been regrettably omitted by Eusebius. However, what can we say about this recurrent complaint of the scholarship that point out some inconsistency in the argument of the similarity of the soul with the idea? I think that this complaint seems to disregard a central issue in the economy of Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo. The main frame of dialogue as a whole is to persuade Cinzia and Cebes to agree that the soul is immortal. Not surprisingly, this very same idea can be seen in the dramatic introduction to the argument from Affinity itself. Socrates commits himself to undo the childish fear of the death of Cebes and Simmias through an effort of persuasion and charm. This effort results in the argument of Affinity we are discussing right now. I hope I will be able to demonstrate that this Socratic persuasion effort should be seen as more than a dramatic strategy of Plato. I would like to be able to claim that a kind of an inversion of the ontological logic could be at play here. I suspect scholarship is generally expecting from Socrates the statement of an ontological dualism stronger than the one he's actually willing to admit. And that's the problem of the complaint, I see. Many scholars have complained about the fact that the soul is not incorruptible, like the forms are. But the fact is that the soul is actually not incorruptible. In my view, Socrates' argument does not want to state that the soul is incorruptible, is not incorruptible. Indeed, even though Socrates' argument seems to stress the common invisibility of the soul and form, he does not even try to bring the two together when it comes to the immutability. While the forms are, by definition, unchanging, the soul, on the contrary, is permanently subject to change. And here is the passage under discussion. Weren't we also saying some time ago that whenever the soul uses the body for investigating something, whether through seeing or through hearing or through some other sense, for to investigate something through the body is to do so through the senses? So the soul, it is dragged by the body into things that are never identical to themselves. And she walks around in confused state, staggering like drunk, being attached to realities like these. The term tarattetai, which is we translated to be in a confused state, and the passage as a whole seems to refer to a parallel discussion held a few pages before, more precisely at 66a5. Here in 66, the senses are perceived as an hindrance, taratontos, exactly, preventing the embodied soul to reach the through. Similarly, in the passage we translated right now above, this process is described by Socrates mainly toward of the dangers of perversion of the soul when it wants to use the body to investigate the sensible world. We are going to call this process somatization of the souls, since the term somatoides is referred twice in this very passage. Something in this description of the somatization of the souls grants, I believe, an unprecedented ontological possibility. Surprisingly enough, the soul, unlike the forms, which are invincibly immaterials, may even take bodily traits. These vivid portraits of the soul, which staggering like drunk, hosper methusa, is dragged by the body and walks around in confused states, seems to want to reveal something more precise than the usual concept of the soul being attached to the body. Allow me to explore two specific features from this image of the soul. The first is that the soul seems to take bodily traits. The poisoning of the soul being drunk, seems to suggest that. This picture is substantially different from the one of a simple imprisonment of the soul inside of the bodily shell. You know, being trapped in the shell would not imply any kind of contamination. You know what I mean? And the second conclusion, or more exploration, I would say, on this, is that the process of incarnation of the soul into the body does not appear to be the result of a passive entrapment of the soul by the body. No passivity seems to be at stake here. On the contrary, what apparently is going on here is the soul moving towards the body, approaching the body, and wanting to make use of it in order to know the world through the senses. The term used here is, of course, aesthesis, and aesthesis is repeatedly twice in this page. A good reader of the Phaedo, like, for example, our friend Fiera again, here, easily recognize both the idea of palingenesis, which is a core point in the first argument of the Phaedo, the argument for immortality, and this anamnesis, which is the core point of the second argument. Also, they imply a kind of inclination of the soul toward the coupling with the body. In the first argument, and it's a coupling, and in the second argument, like, we can see a positive function of senses, since knowledge is the result from an interaction between the information that our senses give us and universal notion under which we can classify our sense data, and which is the anamnesis approach. Here in the affinity argument, the third one, we can see some kind of continuity of this idea. Bostock, as we mentioned, is very famous, a very important commentary on the Phaedo. So in the soul, as depicted, as we can see here, a chameleon or chameleon-like characters, allowing it to take bodily traits in order to grasp the sensible world. I always find this chameleon image very, very appealing. I will quote a brief commentary from Bostock, 1986 commentary and translation. This chameleon-like characters assign the soul a chameleon-like characters. It simply takes on the nature of whatever it is thinking of, and is not much of a ground for saying that it is more like what is unchanging than what is changeable. The soul does whatever it wants. The soul, therefore, can turn, and more than that, she wants, or it wants, to transform itself in order to feel the world through the body. Facing this sort of ontology of a kind of an incarnation I've tried to outline, therefore, the possibility of an unprecedented meaning for the psychophysical dualism insinuates itself surreptitiously within these Platonic pages. like a chameleon, maybe. The vocabulary of the somatization of the soul, to confine ourselves exclusively to this argument from affinity page, includes terms like koinoneo, synemi, homilia, as well as the somatoides adjective I mentioned before. In addition, of course, to the very term syngeneia, which traditionally names the argument affinity as a whole. But the correct understanding of the meaning of this dualism will probably depend on how we would translate a central term for Socrates' argument. These modalities of somatization of the soul I mentioned before are possible, Socrates says, due to the fact that the soul is symphyton with the body. And this is the core passage here. So instead, I suppose, the soul will be intermingled with the corporeal, which the body's company and coupling, because of their constant coupling and because of its longing practice, have made grown together. And this is the symphyton term. I here adopt Rose translation, Chris Rose translation of the term symphyton as made grown together in the soul, pointed here, as he does, to a botanical metaphor. I do that, however, with a slight but quite significant correction. While Rose is thinking about a body growing inside the soul, like a stone that grows at the root of a tree, this is a Rose explanation. I believe that the term symphyton is ontologically stronger than Rose is actually prepared to admit. I have discussed this with him. Of course, we don't agree. The fascinating idea hidden in the term is the one of a body that grows along with the soul. So not at the root of a tree, but along with the soul. My correction, not by chance, follows a lectio facilior in translating symphyton. Rose's elegant solution is that the term refers to the process of growing, but I believe it has more to do with the result of growing together. So there will be in the term symphyton more precisely the indication of a connaturality between body and soul. A good example of the use of the term symphyton can be found in the Aristotle Topics, where Aristotle says, pain is the violent interruption of naturally attached part, symphyton meron. The term symphyton means here precisely the union of parts to such a natural point that the separation could only be violent and consequently generates pain. The coupling of body and soul so does not appear to be accidental in my way. That's why I'm slightly modifying Rose's interpretation. It would be accidental if it was the case of a stone growing inside the root of a tree. On the contrary, it's like the two parts naturally join in the definition of pain from Aristotle Topics, like two brothers, two sisters, for instance, who grew up together and whose violent separation can only cause pain. This is the symphyton I'm looking for. The vocabulary of this communion and connaturality between the body and the soul seems to put in serious trouble any interpretation of the argument from affinity, which wants to look at the argument exclusively from the point of view of the soul having affinity with the invisible and unchangeable. What is described here, rather, is the struggle of the soul in its double chameleonic nature, grown along with the body, but aspiring to the company of invisible gods. For, as we said, in this case, there will be, within the scholarship, an unjustified emphasis on the ontological dualism, which will be stronger than the one emerging from this page. The soul, in this argument from affinity in the Phaedo, is not incorruptible as the forms are, because its ontological status would not allow it, due to its inescapable physical traits. Consequently, instead of being a strong ontological premise, the separation of body and soul could be understood as something to be conquered with violence and pain, to refer ourselves once again to the wonderful image from Aristotle Topics I quoted. The ontological dualism seems to depend on a permanent effort of the individual, both an epistemological and an ethical effort. What I'm willing to claim here is that the very ontological resistance of the body-soul dualism rely on the effort of the individual to keep the two, body and soul, separated. Thus, a moral separation precedes the ontological one, not the other way, as we have been usually taught to believe. The Platonic dualistic ontology seems to want to rely on the search for truth and happiness of a soul, chameleon soul, in its wandering through the sensible world, along with its fellow, the body, with which it grew up and developed throughout the entire existence. Thank you very much. I think the time is okay.
Thank you so much, Professor. Very interesting talk indeed. And now we're gonna proceed to commentary. It's going to be done by Jorge Matias de Almeida Júnior. Jorge has a BA, an MA, and a PhD in philosophy, all from the Federal University of Minas Gerais, UFMG, with a doctoral stay at the Ottawa University. So, Jorge, if you will.
Just a second. Are you seeing my text?
Yes.
So, thank you so much. As I don't speak English very well, my comment will take the form of a reading. In case you don't understand what I'm saying, I will share with you the text so you can follow along, okay? So first, I would like to thank the organizers of this symposium, Pedro Dotto, Luiz Eduardo Freitas, and Antonio Kastenetsky, for inviting me to participate in this interesting event. I would like to apologize to you because I don't speak English very well. I faced a dilemma during the preparation from this work because on the one hand, I felt unprepared. On the other hand, I didn't want to be left out of this event. I decided to take the risk of accepting the task. So I would like to ask you for a little patience and goodwill. I would also like to say that it's an honor for me to comment on Professor Cornelli's lecture, whom I greatly admire. In addition to this conference, I will take into account 2 articles by Professor Cornelli on the same subject, one from 2016, written in Portuguese, and another from 2019, written in English and published in a book edited by Springer. Due to the limited time available, I will limit myself to one about 3 pages, knowing that Professor Cornelli's thesis is more complex than my presentation suggests and would require more detailed analysis. So Cornelli places his analysis on the affinity argument in the Phaedo and on the separation between body and soul at issue there. He suggests a distinction between 2 ways of understanding the separation between soul and body proposed by Socrates. The first of these could be called unintentional or moral separation, and it has to do with the ethical and epistemological attitude of distancing oneself from the body in order to focus on the soul, which Socrates calls a practice to die easily, Phaedo 81a. The second sense of separation is called ontological, and it says that the soul is independent of the body and can survive the body's death, Phaedo 106de. According to Cornelli, the second meaning would contain the highest degree of dualism. In this case, following the most common opinion, we would have in the Phaedo a clear case of how morality conforms to ontology, or what the author calls an anticipated homicide of the body. However, according to Cornelli, the opposite is true. It's not ontological dualism that precedes moral and epistemological dualism, as is commonly thought, but it's the moral and epistemological meaning of the separation between soul and body that precedes the ontological meaning. Moral separation exerts an influence on the ontological resistance of body-soul dualism. In Cornelli's words, what I'm willing to claim here is that the very ontological resistance of the body-soul dualism relies on the effort of the individual to keep the two separated. 2019, page 30. So according to Cornelli, in the affinity argument, commentators would be expecting from Socrates a stronger dualism than the philosopher would be willing to admit. Much has been discussed about the weakness of the argument with which Socrates seeks to persuade Simmias and Cebes that the soul is immaterial and that it survives the death of the body. However, for Cornelli, Socrates' argument does not exactly want to prove that the soul is uncorruptible as the ideas are. This is because Socrates thinks that the soul has a chameleon-like character, an expression by David Bostock, 1986, that Cornelli takes up in his article. In this case, it means that the chameleon soul not only can transform, but she actually wants to transform in order to fill the sensible world through the body. According to Cornelli, in the Phaedo, we can observe a process of somatization of the soul. The vocabulary of this somatization includes terms such as koinonel, synemi, homilia, as well as syngeneia, affinity, which gives the argument its name. Cornelli takes up passage 81d from the Phaedo, in which Socrates says that some souls wander like ghosts around tombs. Furthermore, Cornelli highlights how Socrates twice uses the adjective somatoides to speak of the soul when she uses the body. The whole process of somatization of the soul is possible because the soul is said to be symphyton with respect to the body, which Cornelli translates as made grow together. According to Cornelli, the adjective symphyton and Socrates' botanical metaphor imply that the body not only grows within the soul, but that it grows together with the soul. Cornelli cites Aristotle as support in the Topics, where the philosophers state that pain is the violent interruption of naturally united parts, to show that the use of the adjective symphyton can indicate a union to such a natural point that a separation would be violent and painful. To understand the separation between soul and body, Cornelli replaces the relationship of imprisonment with that of fraternity and communication. The body and soul are connatural and have a communion. Instead of prison, the body is seen as a brother of the soul, which wants to be with it and who feels pain when separated from it. Cornelli intends to demonstrate a certain kind of inversion of the ontological logic at play in the argument. According to him, there is in the description of the process of the somatization of the soul an ontological possibility that is somehow unprecedented. Hence the title of Cornelli's 2019 paper. Surprisingly, the soul, unlike the ideas, which are totally immaterial, can even take bodily traits. In Cornelli's words, what is described here, rather, is the struggle of the soul and its double chameleonic nature. Grow along with the body, but aspiring to the company of invisible gods. For, as we said, in this case, there would be, within the scholarship, an unjustified emphasis on an ontological dualism, which will be stronger than the one emerging from these pages. 2019, page 30. Cornelli agrees with Sarah Brody, 2001, and claims that Plato's dualism is far from being a substance dualism like that of Descartes. Then he quotes Gabriele Caroni, 2005, to assume what seems to be the main thesis of his conference. It is the idea that the existence of the soul separated from the body, the approach that would contain the strongest dualism, cannot be considered as a coherent and definitive theory that one can find in Plato's writings. So 2019, page 25. From this point of view, the psychological innovations of Aristotle and the Stoics appear to be much less abrupt than one might imagine. Plato, in the Phaedo, shows signs of hesitation and indecision in asking to what extent the soul is immaterial or not. And Plato does this by highlighting what Cornelli calls the chameleon-like soul and the epistemological and moral ductility of the soul. That is, the fact that the soul can assume bodily traits to know the world through the body. For Cornelli, it's not necessary to wait until the so-called later dialogues to see Plato questioning the strong dualistic approach that he himself would have elaborated in his middle dialogues. Cornelli says, I believe some kind of indecision and nuances on his dualistic approach can be seen right from the Phaedo itself, that is, from at least the middle dialogues. 2019, page 25, note 4. In conclusion, from my perspective, in Cornelli's lecture, there is a starting point for a critique of the dualism between body and soul in Platonic philosophy, and even a critique of dualism in more broader terms, such as the dualism of two separate and opposite worlds. So to conclude, I would like to suggest some questions to Professor Cornelli. 1, wouldn't there still be a difference between feeling the world through the body and knowing the world? Would not knowledge itself be a mark of the so-called intelligible world, which would be precisely separate from this word here, our world? Does this not maintain the ontological dualism traditionally ascribed to Plato? 2, you never use this expression, but from a certain point of view, your reading emphasizes the subject of knowledge and sensation, getting closer to what we could call the subjective side of the relationship between soul and body. In your reading, souls can assume bodily traits as a chameleon assumes a color to camouflage itself, and in this sense, Plato would be hesitating to establish the existence of the soul as totally independent of the body to the point of surviving its death. The same, in fact, cannot be said of ideas, which are one of the types of objects that exist and are aimed at by the soul in its activity of contemplation. In this sense, if they are the ideas, unlike the soul, certainly exist independently of any corporeal trait, wouldn't there still be strong dualism in Plato? Or, put another way, if it seems possible to attenuate the body-soul dualism in Plato from the point of view of the individual, as you put it, it's also possible to admit a deflation of dualism from a perspective that we could call objective. So, and to finish, the third question, Understandably, you claim in your conference that you cannot offer an account of the existing discussion among scholars as to whether Plato is a strong dualist or whether we should take this dualism with a grain of salt. But I would like to get an idea of your views on dualism in Platonic work more broadly. More specifically, I would like to know if you think that your positions on the Phaedo can corroborate a criticism of the traditional interpretation of the two words theory ascribed to Plato, along the lines of what we see in the work of authors such as, for example, Gail Fine, Francisco Gonzalez, Deborah Nails, and Marcelo Marx from Brazil. That's what I had to say. Thank you very much for your attention, and sorry for my bad English.
Thank you so much, Josh. It was actually really good, your commentary, very clarifying in a lot of points. And then I believe Professor Cornelli will want to respond to that. But first, I would like to ask if any of you have any questions or comments to make, please. There is here in Zoom an option to raise your hand and the reactions button. So in this way, we can get a line of people to question if there are a lot of questions. So, Professor, do you want to respond to George?
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, I must disclose to all of you that George very kindly sent me this text from him, so I had time to think about it. But I must say I don't have all the answer he's probably wanting me to have, George. I think the basic question I would like to address is exactly this idea. Well, on the first one, the idea of a kind of individualism between senses and this kind of knowledge that the soul could have independent from the coupling with the body. I think that's it's okay, no problem at all. You can find in Plato's writings in many ways, and this idea of a soul having a direct knowledge of something you can see or perceive or taste and something. Okay, what is, I think, has been understated in a way and not very well, probably still not very well developed by our scholarship, is the opposite thing. So no problem at all. I told it, I mentioned at the beginning, we have two polarities. We have different ways by which Plato is looking at what is sensible and what is not sensible. What I think we should try to recalibrate in a way is why Plato is doing that. So we need to, if you understand that this theory of the supposed two words, I will prefer to call it two polarities of the same reality, I would say. So why Plato why Plato needs this kind of awkward solution. And it's awkward. In the Parmenides, this is very well stated. So this is a very applause solution, Socrates says, this separation of the two realms in a way. So why Plato is insisting on this? Of course, we know why. He needs some kind of foundation of the knowledge in order to build up a city and all this thing. So what I think that if you think in a Wittgensteinian way, not what this dualism is, but what this dualism is working for, you know, why he needs this dualism, I think you can recalibrate all of this huge two-world theory, this megalomaniac idea. And why we have, I think we should try to do that in every single piece of Plato's works, because dualism, of course, hurts people. we have been hurted throughout all the Western civilization history from this kind of a myth of a dualism, you know, hurted from, of course, a racist point of view, a gender point of view. So dualism is bad. And it's bad not because Plato invented the dualism. It's bad because, as Monique so very well pointed out, we substitute the Platonism to Plato's dialogues. And we use Plato as an authority for some kind of a strong dualism. He's probably not his intention, you know. There is something more, I think, I would like to address on this. So when we try to jump off, and I will be very brief because I want to hear more people on this probably. So when we jump off this strong dualistic approach, and we focus on this idea of the relation between two polarities, two kind of opposite polarities, but in the same line, this is the idea of polars, you know? So when we focus on this, first of all, Plato is way more interesting than Descartes, for example, or these modern crazy dualistic philosophers, you know? So because if you really try to engage with Plato in what he's doing with this dualistic polar approach, you can find in the middle of the poles a lot of very interesting things. You can find the philosopher being the middle between sky and earth. You can find the soul doing this kind of engagement, sometimes sober, sometimes very drunk, as we all know. You know, you can find the, you can probably understand better the eros thing in the symposium, this error as intermediate, you know. So if you move, if you try to jump off this dualistic, strong dualistic scheme, you will find in Plato amazing engagement from Plato on this intermediate, in the relationship. And this allows you, in a very interesting way, to put Plato in direct, very direct dialogue, discussion with the contemporary metaphysics. You know, some of the contemporary metaphysics, like Feynman, for example, or even Stryker. Stryker wrote a wonderful piece. Stryker is one of the most important analytical philosophers today. He wrote a wonderful piece in our Plato journal a few years ago on the Parmenides one and many. And it was amazing how he really could engage with Plato. Why? Because they understood that Plato was challenging a traditional metaphysical way of looking at the reality and looking to something that is more relational. So things, this metaphysics of relation, contemporary metaphysics, things are not what they are. Things are defined in the relationship between things. You know, I'm not saying very good because I forgot the exact terms of this. But you know, so what the reality of things is what is in relation. And I was looking at my library. There is actually in the Theaetetus 160b this same idea that what we are is what are we in relation with. So Socrates says that whether we are or whether we become, are or we come for each other. For our being is by necessity decree tied to a partner, yet we are tied neither to any other thing in the world, nor to our respective selves. You can say that this is Theaetetus. Theaetetus saying what we are because we have a partner, because we are in relationship with something. So just a small, you know, a small cameo of what we could do if we agree to jump off this modern interpretation. And thank you, George, for mentioning our beloved friend, past friend, Marcelo, who has been a master and a teacher to all of us, Marcelo. But this idea comes before the ones you mentioned. Allen, Chernis, they were doing this, they were going on this path of challenging this dualism very strongly. And then, of course, the one you mentioned, they are very good. Thank you very much.
I believe now Anne Schultz raised her hand first. Yeah.
Hi, that was a fantastic paper. And I think this is more of a playground bully comment, as Jill said yesterday about the Republic, and one in support. You know, in the myth of the souls appear to still have bodies also. They're in a meadow, they're greeting each other, they tell stories. And so I'm kind of just wondering, does it ever separate, or how far you really want to claim this? I really like that notion of grown together. I mean, is there really ever a separation, and how wrong-minded maybe we are as a tradition to insist that there is one?
Thank you very much. And I gave some thoughts on the myth of recently. And yes, so the choice of the souls in the myth of they are passionate, you know, most of them, they are totally passionate, and therefore they are wrong in their choices.
Yeah.
They do very bad choices because the soul are still entangled with the past life and the sentiments and the rage sometimes, or just some kind of fear, you know. And the only one who makes, it's said in the myth of Hera, of course, who makes a very good choice is Odysseus, because it takes time. So he's not using these bodily features to choose in a way. So I totally agree with you. And I think that even if you let me go a bit more on this, what the souls are choosing are paradigmata of life, models. So an entire life, a bit design, not totally design, but quite of design. And this life, it's both a soul and body life, I would say. And this is even more interesting, I would say. So they're not choosing bodies. They are choosing the mixture of body and souls in a kind of a life, which is very well stated there. So partly determined by what you are, and partly depends from your. So again, I think this is my stance here. You have to do your coupling body-soul from a moral point of view. So the ontological coupling is less interesting than what you are doing with this in your next life. You know what I mean? So yeah, it is not because you are connected, it's what you do with the connection, how you manage to be together. Sorry.
That's great. Thank you. That was really wonderful. Great answer.
Okay, so now Cinzia, I believe, raise her hand after.
Yeah, thank you for your rich paper. I have a very small question. I was wondering whether you connect the passages on on what you call the somatization of the soul, so the soul taking up some features that are connected to the body, whether you connect this to the theory we find in Timaeus and in part in the Glaucus image in the Republic, that then with embodiment, the soul acquires the non-rational parts that it doesn't need when it is not embodied, and so on. And whether you think that this is what is going on a bit in the Phaedo, implicitly.
Yes, thank you. This will be maybe a second part of the paper. I should try to reach the end. You know, that I was stuck for very personal reasons. You know, I'm working with the translation of the Phaedo. So I was stuck in the beginning of this, you know. But of course, we can find throughout all the Plato corpus, and of course, in these two passages you mentioned, this a similar idea of we should, as I said, jump off this kind of simplistic way of thinking about the interaction between body and soul. So the embodiment, it's the incarnation, I would call it, a very provocative way, of course. So this incarnation, this embodiment is kind of a something that Plato is definitely thinking about this. This is what is important to Plato, not the separation, but how this works, how they work together. Of course it is important. Only a crazy guy would think about the separation. The separation stops the thinking, you know what I mean? Separation is like something that, okay, they're separate, okay, nothing. No, what we have to do in our lives from a psychological point of view and psychoanalytical point of view in a way is trying to, how do we live with this supposed two parts of our life? So, okay, thank you, Cinzia. Grazie.
Now, Jill.
So I just want to echo Anne's point and thank you both, the commentator as well, George. Lots of good things here. I want to say that you could push your thesis, which I'm very sympathetic with, even further. And I want to suggest a couple things. One, beyond what you called the somatization of the soul, where, you know, it utilizes the body to investigate the world. Of course, the soul is also what Socrates wants to affect and change in the very act we call philosophy. And so philosophy itself is situated at that very place that you're talking about, where the soul is, you know, kind of reaching toward this world and trying to understand it, but also reaching toward, well, what is justice? What is virtue, right? When we're thinking those things, that's also a movement, that metabole of the soul. And then I wanted to also, I do actually have a question. Oh, two more quick points and then a question. We've got lots of instances in dialogues, and I'll just mention two, where the interlocutors talk about a third thing. And so you've got the Timaeus, of course, and also Parmenides. And so there's a disruption to the dualism, even in the conversations where they're invoking a kind of dualism. I wanted to recommend Drew Hyland's book called Questioning Platonism. And it's just totally in sync with your project about wanting to break down what Plato is doing in the dialogues from Platonism. And so here's my question. You used language like the soul wants to do things, the soul aspires to do things. And you invoked Aristotle, and George also talked about the connection between Plato and both Aristotle and the Stoics. And I can't help but think about desire. Desire is movement of the soul, and in a way that's parallel to your project of saying the moral is fundamental. I think we could also say desire is fundamental here. That's what moves the soul, whether it's to investigate the empirical world or to think about the forms. And you started to talk a little bit about desire in your response to George. So maybe I'm sort of inviting you to say a little bit more about that. And I was put into mind of the very first line of Aristotle's Metaphysics. All human beings by nature desire to know, and it's eregisthai there instead of eros. But anyway, if you could talk a little bit about desire in the soul as a source of movement between these two worlds or realities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jill. A lot of good stuff in my plate, and I really don't know how where to start, but let's start from probably this idea of Socrates addressing souls in, yeah. I'm tempted. We are between friends. You are not publishing all this, I hope. So the discussion, I mean. So I'm tempted to translate soul with individual, with person. You know what I mean? So soul is not mind. Soul, as we see in the air, for example, the myth of air, soul is who we are. So when Socrates, I think that when Socrates is talking with the souls of Athens, he's talking with the people, not only one part. So this is not, I would say, a problem for my project. I would say that well, basically the soul is, because the soul is really what we are, and that's why the reincarnation, the metempsychosis, is so important. Because we have this kind of individual permanence throughout lives, not only bodies, throughout lives. And this is what we are, and our memory. And so the first thing I think is that, so philosophy is for souls, meaning that philosophy is for people with all this personhood, individuality in a way. The desire is what really led me to this text. So this soul wandering, I think Eloni, a young PhD scholar from Oxford, once told me about this when she was here in Brazil. So it's like a zombie thing. I think this zombie image is very nice. So this soul wandering, you know, looking for bodies, to kind of a drunk, you know. So this, it's clearly a picture of desire. Even from a moral point of view, probably something reproachable. It's too much desire. But this too much desire of knowing through the body, can we really say that it is not what the souls are really doing? You know what I mean? So soul desire is for knowledge, but the soul in a dualistic perspective has not a body to perceive the reality. The soul wants to perceive the reality and then needs the body. This is kind of a way of desire of koinonia, I would say. So the communion between soul and body, admittedly not really exactly what it is, but something you have to, a soul is looking for. It's kind of the point here. So the desire is not only desire for pleasure, for example, through the body. I think it could be, but the desire of koinonia, a desire of knowledge, and then through knowledge, koinonia. I think that I was thinking, I worked on this maybe 7 years ago. I started to work with this, and every time I think about this, I'm quite sure there is a lot of work to do to rewrite in a way the ways we thought about this dualism. I think that we should really get rid of more modern, not contemporary, but more modern's idea of dualism, body soul, in order to understand how complex could be picture this relationship and the consequences of this relation. So desire is absolutely central to this. Maybe even in the opposite way. So the body is desiring the soul in a way. So we can think about this. Let me think about this. It's very nice. Thank you, Jay.
Cinzia, your hand is raised. I don't know if you want to make another question. Okay. Professor. Oh, okay. So Antonio.
Just a quick question. Thank you very much, Professor Gabriele, for your very interesting talk. I'd like to ask you a little bit more about why, given this interconnectedness between soul and body, at least in embodied existence, and given what you say about the parallels between this recovers a little bit something that George talked about as well. You say that the soul's desire to investigate the world is necessarily tied to its connection with the body, right? So why is the connection of soul and body and this pulling towards the world that's determined by the connection between soul and body, why is it still called corruption? Why is corruption still a term that should be used? So that's just a point that I'd like to raise.
Yes, of course. Thank you. This is a very good point, I would say. So why in the Phaedo, for example, this is not good? I would say it doesn't matter if it's good or not. This is how it works. You know what I mean? So you can use this in the Phaedo. He needs to prove that the immortal life is better than this one. It's a persuasion move from Socrates. He said, no, don't worry. Of course, we are together here. It's good to be together. Bodies connected, talking, and you need a mouth to talk, discussion, dialogue. But don't worry. We can think about a different life, a better life in the immortality. So what I think that it is really not important how you treat in the Phaedo, for example, this kind of connection. You know what I mean? Because, okay, this is a corruption in this, it would be possible to think about the soul, immortal soul, separated from the body, but it is actually not. And that's the point, we have to, that's why I was trying to say, we need to rewrite the things in order to understand to which extent we can, and for example, this idea of corruption, what is the real corruption here? It's a simple corruption, it's totally corruption, or there is something that, for example, this desire Jill mentioned, or there is a way of the soul desiring the body that could be acceptable from another point of view, So what I think that it's important to focus here is not the result from the Phaedo, Phaedo project, but to see that there is something happening which is not a strong dualism here. What we do about it, that's, I think, that's the problem. But of course, we shouldn't agree. We should agree, sorry, that the general frame of this relation between body and soul in the Phaedo is a negative approach to the body. Of course it is. It doesn't mean that it's always negative in all the Plato's works, first of all, and it doesn't mean that this kind of approach is a strong dualistic approach. I don't think so. If not, the soul couldn't be drunk, intoxicated by the soul. And it's just a starting point, I would say, for further discussion. Thank you, Antonio.
Yeah, Professor, I would just like to take on this point, perhaps, or similar points, because I believe, as you said, I think we could all agree that Plato is trying to state something about the superiority or hierarchy between soul and body. And in many instances, he also has a strong critique of bodily pleasures, right? And so I would ask, and you said also that if you could, I think your thesis is pretty much that this ontological dualism or separation is preceded by the moral one, right? And I would like to understand a little better what does precede mean in that context? I mean, does it mean that Plato is starting from the moral separation, from the moral dualism, and then artificially constructing an argument which points perhaps to an ontological separation, even though it's not a strong separation or a strong dualism? Because I always think it's kind of hard in Plato to separate ontology and moral and ethics and psychology things. So I don't know, I think this is a very general question, but it's pretty much, what do you mean by precede in that phrase? I don't know if I made myself clear.
Yes, thank you, Luiz Eduardo. My idea that the moral separation precedes the ontological one is more a provocation, of course, in saying that it is not really important how things are. So if this separation is really a definitive one, or it is really working, or it exists in any realm of reality. But what interests Plato, and this is a very general idea, I think, when we approach it, is what you do about it. So this, what Plato is looking at, it's what you do about your clothes and your shoes and the money you have. So this is, I'm quoting the page right before in the Phaedo itself. So what you do about that is what it's really important, not how things are, because we don't know how things are actually, but we know how can we do, what can we do about what we think that things are. So the knowledge, the epistemological or metaphysical approach, we can discuss, of course, about it, and there are open solutions for that, even in Plato's works. So Plato's, I think it's clear for him that there is no final statement on this, but what we have to pay attention to and what we do about it. So we don't know how body-soul theory would work exactly, but I know that I have to pay attention in a moral way to this kind of things. And my suggestion, and provoking suggestion in a way, was that if we pay attention to this, we will find out at the end some kind of solution. So we start, you know what I mean? We start doing what we think it's better to do from a moral and political way, and we will find at the end what it is. You know, that's the, so I'm quoting, of course, it's a kind of very strong statement, and it's a provocative one. And on the pleasure and pain, you mentioned this idea of pleasure. It is very interesting that at the beginning of the Phaedo, and I think this is kind of a general framework for the dialogue, Plato is talking about exactly pleasure and pain. So pleasure and pain are the real questions, I would say. Not only, you can think about the Philebus discussion at the end, but, you know, it is not true what a strong dualistic approach would say, that pleasure is something we shouldn't look at, because Plato is always thinking about pleasure and pain like two sources of our life. Well, I can easily admit that pleasure is for the soul, but I know pleasure for the body also. So do we think, I'm not asking you directly, Luiz, but do we think that Plato is, when he's thinking about the pleasure, is always thinking like, I don't know, medieval theologian monk on the pleasure of the soul? Hardly. So that's I think a good argument in favor of the anti-dualistic thing, because pleasure and pain are sentiments, are feelings that can hurt both body and soul. Don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. So, Vicente, if you can actually ask your question quickly, because we're almost out of time here. Yeah. Oh, your mic is turned off.
First
Nice
of all,
cap, Cinzia.
I would like to thank Professor Cornelli for a so interesting presentation. Well, it's a general question, and I'm curious to know if you would think about Nietzsche when you have such a point, because I remembered straightforward the chapter of Zarathustra about the self overcoming, something like that. And I even read, I've just read the passage. He said, will to truth is actually will to the thinkability of all beings. Well, I'm saying that because the question of truth is very important. If you are just changing this way of thinking about Plato, not in a dualistic way, because the foundation of truth is very important for this whole ontological apparatus Plato proposed. So I just would like, if it's a too general question, but I think that the question of truth is very important if you are looking for a different perspective in reading Plato. That's it.
I couldn't agree more. I think that truth is hard. Plato is very clear about that. Truth is something you have to work very hard to find. And you are not sure from the beginning that you can find it. And one of the problems is probably this coupling between body and soul, and the hindrance that this kind of person we are put ourselves in some kind of a difficult path to truth. You know, if we were angels, maybe, but I'm not totally sure. Thank you, Vicente.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor, for the discussion. And now we're gonna proceed to our next talk, our next discussion. And now, Professor Cinzia Arruzza, I hope I actually pronounced her name right. She's professor of philosophy at the New School for Social Research. Her research interests range from ancient philosophy, Socrates, Plato, Plotinus, to Marxism and feminist philosophy. Among her books is Feminism for the 99%, Manifesto, with Tici Bhattacharya and Nancy Fraser, and A Wolf in the City, Tyranny and the Tyrant in Plato's Republic, published by Oxford University Press. So, please, Cinzia.
Yeah, thank you very much, first of all, to the organizers of this wonderful conference. And I'm also glad to be here to share the panel with Gabriele. So I'm very glad to be here. And this is Pedro, who has decided that he's interested in Plato today. So hopefully we will not disrupt the whole talk. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my paper, because I'm going to read. Can you see it? But I can't. Wait.
Not yet.
No, okay. Why? Just a second. Resume share. It's not working. Okay, I don't know. Share.
Professor, maybe if you stop sharing and start sharing again, it will go.
Yeah, it's what I'm trying to do.
Okay.
Sorry. Share screen again. Let's try it. It says my screen sharing is paused. Okay, this is not happening. I don't know why, sorry, but I will try one last time. No.
Is your window open, Professor?
Yes.
That's strange.
Yeah, it says
okay.
your screen sharing is paused. I don't know why is this the case. Yeah, now
it worked now. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Okay, now I understood what the problem was. Okay. Okay. So in book 5 of Plato's Republic, Socrates famously puts forward a set of radical policies regarding women and the upbringing of the children of Callipolis guardians. These policies are articulated in two distinct but interconnected waves. The first wave establishes that women with the required natural talent should receive the same education as the male guardians and share in the same activities. The second wave concerns the institution of eugenic marriage rules, the production of children, and their communal upbringing. This section of the Republic has prompted wildly divergent interpretations among scholars. And in this paper, I will focus on the status of the first wave. So against interpretations of the first wave as expedient or derivative from the second, I argue that the first wave represents an autonomous argument standing on its own feet. I provide three main bodies of evidence in support of this reading. First, I show that the argument is a distinctive Platonic version of a genuinely Socratic tenet. That is, a tenet that was shared by other Socratic thinkers as well, and that probably was shared by Socrates himself. In this section of the dialogue, therefore, Socrates is expounding on systematizing and radicalizing positions concerning women's soul and virtue that were shared in various degrees, albeit with some relevant differences, by several other Socratics. Second, I show that Plato carefully prefaces the presentation of the first wave with an array of allusions to the context of a law court. These allusions, combined with Socrates' frequent references to the dangers of ridicule and laughter, recall Socrates' trial and Plato's apology. Attention to this apologetic framing, combined with an overview of Socratic positions on women's virtue, suggests that references to laughter are not meant to flag the unserious nature of the proposal at stake. Rather, the first wave's argument should be taken seriously as a genuine argument about the soul's nature and the limits of sexual difference. Finally, I critically discuss interpretations taking the first wave to be expedient and dependent on the second wave, and show that in addition to not taking into account the features of the Socratic debate on women, these interpretations are also incompatible with Plato's Socrates' principle of specialization that is crucial to his definition of justice. So let me start with the first argument, that is the Socratic debate. Now, it is not possible to reconstruct in details the Socratic debate of women, which concern not only virtue and the soul, but also women's education, the educational role of Eros, the figure of Aspasia as either an educator or a corrupter, the role of marriage, and the proper organization of procreation. I will rather confine myself to addressing a few passages and testimonies specifically concerning the identity of the virtue of men and women, and the question of women's potential for virtue and their teachability, insofar as they have an immediate bearing on the interpretation of the first wave of Republic 5. It is quite uncontroversial indeed that several Socratics argued or made their fictional Socrates argue that virtue is one and the same for men and women. Diogenes Laertius famously credits Antisthenes with the claim that the virtue of man and woman is the same. This claim is part of a cursory summary of doctrines and sayings ascribed to Antisthenes, several of which concern the teachability of virtue and the requirements for acquiring it. As Antisthenes did deem virtue to be teachable, it is possible, actually, I think it is likely, that his claim that virtue is the same for men and women was also connected with the view that women can be taught just as well as men. Statements concerning women's potential for education to virtue are present in Xenophon's Socratic text. The most explicit and articulated are to be found in Socrates' interactions with Antisthenes in the Symposium and in Ischomachus' discussion of the education of his young wife in the Economicus. In the Symposium, Socrates puts forward revisionist views about women's potential for education. That these views should be considered as anti-conformist can be gathered from the fact that in these passages, Socrates explicitly uses empirical evidence to challenge those who may still question women's natural equality with men or their potential for acquiring skills and virtues. At 2.9 of the Symposium, after observing the feats of a girl acrobat, Socrates argues that the girl's performance is evidence of the fact that a woman's nature is teachable. He then concludes inviting his fellow symposiasts to set about to teach their wives whatever they wish. According to the manuscript edition, in this passage, Socrates claims that women's nature is not inferior to that of men, except for force and strength. I here take the Lange's emendation, sorry, except for intellect and strength, but I take here Lange's emendation, according to which, in fact, we need to read in this text Rome and not Gnome, for reasons that is too long to explain, but let's say that the reading of Gnome is a bit incompatible with the insistence of Socrates in this passage on women's teachability and the language he uses to express this. Socrates further insists on women's ability to acquire skills and virtues a few lines later at 2:11-12. Where observing with some trepidation the dancer somersaults in and out of a hoop with upright swords, he argues that this performance is evidence that Andrea is teachable, given that the dancer obviously displays it despite being a woman. And here the suggestion, obviously, in the implicit suggestion is that women are not naturally inclined to courage. Hence, the fact that a woman displays courage is the evidence that courage is a teachable virtue. So the most extensive discussion of women's ability to learn the same virtues as men is in the Economicus 7:7-8, where Ischomachus describes at length the education of his young wife and engages in a bit of anthropological theory about men's and women's natural predispositions and their complementarity. Ischomachus' view is that the god granted equally to both men and women memory and attention, as well as the capacity to practice self-control, which in Xenophon is usually the foundation of all the other virtues. There are also natural differences, though, which are grounded in the god's intelligent design. Men's bodies and minds are more capable of endurance, and men also have greater natural predisposition to courage, while women are more prone to fear and their bodies are weaker. These natural differences enable men and women to work as partners, as a complementary couple, with a specialization of occupations which sees men engage outdoor and women indoor in the activities of procreation, rearing of the children, and household management. But again, the thrust of the argument in the Economicus is that the virtue of men and women is not different in kind. So men and women can have different natural predisposition towards one or another virtue. So women are less naturally predisposed to courage, but the courage that women acquire is the same courage that men acquire. And in terms of let's say, intellectual skills and natural predispositions, basically they are the same. The notion that men and women ultimately need to have at least some of the same virtues to tend to their respective tasks is to be found in Plato's Meno. At the beginning of the dialogue, Meno, an eager student of Gorgias, gives a definition of what constitutes virtue for a man and for a woman. For the first, virtue is the good administration of public affairs, and the ability to harm enemies and benefit friends, as well as to fend off any harm that could come to himself. For the second, virtue is the proper administration of the household, the preservation of the husband's properties, and submission to the husband. Meno concludes that for each of us, there is a proper virtue for each action, each age, and each function. In the ensuing discussion, Socrates opposes this endless multiplication of virtues by forcing Meno to recognize that ultimately the different tasks he has enumerated all presuppose and require the same virtues regardless of age, sex, or status. Both the management of the household and that of the city demand justice and moderation. Hence, both men and women need justice and moderation if they are to be good. Socrates' argument in this passage shares some similarities with Ischomachus' discourse in the Economicus. There too, Ischomachus insists on the fact that household management requires qualities such as memory and attention that the good has dispensed equally to men and women, although these qualities are then put to work in different tasks and separate spheres. And it requires self-control. And in fact, Ischomachus claims that women can actually get even more self-control and criteria than men. All these texts taken together show that at least some of the Socratics share the view that women are naturally endowed with the same natural predispositions as men and can therefore be taught the same virtues. Xenophon, Socrates, and Ischomachus are careful about clarifying where natural differences lie: bodily strength, strength of the mind, and predisposition to courage, whereby these differences ground a sexual division of labor and marriage as a partnership. On the contrary, in the first wave of the Republic, the tenet that women's nature endows them with the ability to acquire the same virtues as men is put to work to justify a critique of the existing exclusion of women from education and military and political activities. If women have the same natural predispositions as men have, and there is only a difference in degree, at least as far as the soul is concerned, then what could possibly justify social arrangements that confine them to one single task, namely that of household management and procreation? Surely differences in reproductive organs do not have much to do with the skills required to govern a city. Seen in this light, the argument of the first wave is part and parcel of a Socratic debate about women's nature, their potential for virtue, and their teachability. In further support of my reading of the first wave as an argument standing on its own feet and radicalizing a Socratic tenet, I will now turn to an examination of its apologetic framing. So this is the second part of my argument. Book 5 of the Republic opens with some turmoil. Just when Socrates is about to leave his presentation of the ideal city behind in order to address the corrupt cities and corresponding kinds of men, Polemarchus and Adeimantus become unruly. They feel Socrates is cheating on them as he's trying to elude an important issue he had promised to address: the common possession of women and the production and education of children within the ideal city. Adeimantus and Polemarchus request that Socrates now expound upon this vexed question before moving to analyzing the corrupt cities is immediately backed by Glaucon and Thrasymachus. Forced to bow to Adrastea and to comply with his friend's request, Socrates' response to Adeimantus' query crucially does not begin from the organization of the common possession of women and of the production of children. Rather, Socrates announces that after the completion of the male drama, that is, the presentation of the nature and education of the male guardians of the beautiful city, it is now time to present the female drama. This requires going back to the beginning, to that analogy between male guardians and watchdogs that inaugurated the discussion of their education in books 2 and 3. In book 2, the analogy with pedigree dogs was introduced to make the point that it is possible to find in nature living beings that are at the same time gentle and aggressive. These are the watchdogs, who are gentle and loving to those whom they know, but aggressive against external threats. This analogy foreshadowed the optimal combination of spirit and reason that Socrates deems necessary for the ideal guardians of the ideal city. Insofar as nature offers examples of animals that are both gentle and aggressive, it is in principle possible, that is, not against nature, to find comparable natures among human beings. Similarly, the mention of female watchdogs at 551 CE, so in book 5, is meant both to remind Glaucon and the other interlocutors of the previous discussion and to draw attention to the fact that even in animal species with sexual dimorphism, such as dogs, one does not expect males and females to specialize in different tasks. Rather, males and females are trained equally, and difference in size or physical strength is not deemed to be a sufficient criterion for the assignment of different functions. The close association between guardians and watchdogs, therefore, serves the purpose of showing that it is in principle possible that the same applies to human beings. That is, that the sexual dimorphism among human beings does not license or necessitate the assignment of women and men to different tasks and divergent political and social roles. The analogy forces Glaucon, moreover, to reflect on how unreasonable it would be to keep female watchdogs at home instead of employing them in the guard of the flock together with the male dogs. But if it would be unreasonable in the case of dogs, is it not the case that it is unreasonable in the case of human beings too? I quote, this should be the first text in the handout. If you want to have a look at the Greek, you find it there. Or should we think that we should keep the women at home as if they were powerless because they give birth and raise puppies, while the males must work and have the entire care of the flock? Everything should be in common, except that we should treat the females as weaker, while the males as stronger. End of the quote. The watchdog analogy is not an argument, nor is it intended to be one. In fact, after opening a space for imagining that a common education and shared activities and roles are possible, in the following lines, Socrates does provide a fully fledged argument in support of his policy, and an argument articulated in two parts. The first addresses the question of the feasibility of the proposed policy, and the second, its desirability. The argument for feasibility is framed as a response to an objection Socrates raises on behalf of an unnamed opponent. Based on this objection, assigning the same education and the same tasks to men and women would be in violation of the principle of specialization, according to which each should only do the job that pertains to his or her own nature. In response to this objection, Socrates reminds his interlocutors of the difference between dialectic and heuristic. His unnamed opponent's objection is heuristical because it does not operate the necessary distinctions when addressing the sameness and difference of female and male nature concerning ruling and guarding the city. Males and females only differ in their reproductive functions and their bodily strength, but this difference is inconsequential for the issue at stake, whether some women have the necessary natural predisposition to being raised and educated as guardians and to ruling and guarding. To further prove this claim, Socrates puts forward a somewhat odd argument that as far as the administration of the city is concerned, women do not have any specific sphere of activity pertaining to them qua women, to then conclude that then there is no activity concerning the polis that belongs to either women or men alone. Hence, based on the principle of specialization, people with the required natural predisposition, be they men or women, will need to receive the same education and fulfill the same role within the city. Insofar as the proposed arrangement is not contrary to nature and would rather fulfill natural potentials, its feasibility is demonstrated, and Socrates can move on to the second, much briefer chunk of his argument, which concerns the issue of the proposed policy's desirability. The policy is desirable insofar as it optimizes the city's resources rather than wasting them by confining gifted women to household tasks. The argument for desirability concludes with a polemic addressed to the wits who are all too quick to laugh at what they do not know or are not familiar with. This is text number 2 from the handout. Then the guardian women must strip off their clothes since they will wear virtue instead of clothes, and they must share in war and in the rest of the guardianship of the city and do nothing else. But the lighter parts of them must be assigned to the women instead of the men because of the weakness of their sex. And the man who laughs and naked women training for the sake of what is best is plucking the unripe fruit of laughter from his wisdom and does not know, as it seems, either what is laughing at or what is doing. In fact, this is the finest of present and future sayings, that the beneficial is beautiful while the harmful is ugly. This polemical conclusion is not the first reference to those who may find Socrates' proposals ridiculous. Allusions to the possibility of ridicule and to what constitutes a legitimate target of laughter can be found when Socrates first resists his friend's request to discuss the common possession of women and children. When he first refers to the fact that people may find most of his proposals laughable because contrary to custom, especially the notion of having women exercise naked in the gymnasium, and again, when he claims that one should not fear the vulgar jokes of the wits. Socrates also begs these very wits not to do their proper job, but to be serious and consider that not so long ago, even the Greeks thought it ridiculous to be seen naked, and that the wits of the time likely made a comedy of the Cretans and the Spartans who first created the gymnasiums. This reference to the scurrile jokes of professional wits who make a comedy of whatever they find contrary to custom without further reflecting on its merit is primarily a reference to Aristophanes. In the Apology, Plato's Socrates famously singles out Aristophanes' clouds as an example of those earlier charges that had poisoned the minds of the Athenian citizens against Socrates well before Meletus decided to bring formal charges. Socrates' claim here is that these early charges were the most effective, for they have shaped Socrates' fellow citizens' opinion of him since their childhood and adolescence, at an age when one most readily believes what one is told. Becoming a target of comedic laughter then can be a dangerous business. In fact, the Republic section under investigation significantly contains several references to threats, dangers, and fear. Moreover, the interaction between Socrates and his interlocutors is couched in legal language, evoking the context of a law court. At 449c, Adeimantus accuses Socrates of leaving off an important topic of discussion out of fear. And at 450c, Socrates mentions his fear of touching upon these subjects. The conversation is framed from the very beginning as happening in a law court, with Adeimantus and Polemarchus discussing with each other whether they should acquit Socrates of the charge of robbing them of an important part of the argument, and ultimately deciding not to let him go. A few lines later, Glaucon and Thrasymachus add their own vote to the conviction. Socrates must speak. I quote text number 3. Include me, Glaucon said, as sharing in this vote. Actually, Socrates, Thrasymachus said, take this as the deliberation of all of us. If we keep in mind Polemarchus' use of the verb aphienai, Adeimantus charged that Socrates is robbing them of the argument, the chemical reference to Aristophanes, as well as the various passages mentioning fear or the lack thereof, it appears quite plausible that the general undertone of these and similar passages is a legal one, referring to the context of a law court. In fact, the term stephos, in conjunction with titanai, and the Stardan phrase tauta de dogmena, these things have appeared, can equally refer to the counting of votes in the assembly and to law courts' deliberation. Moreover, Socrates' response to Thrasymachus and Glaucon further emphasizes the legal framework. What have you done, I said, by arresting me? The culmination of this cluster of allusions to the context of a trial with its connected dangers can be found in a crucial exchange between Socrates and Glaucon a few lines later, when Glaucon reassures him that he should not fear, for his interlocutors are neither ill-judging nor incredulous or hostile. Socrates retorts, that this is no encouragement at all. I quote text number 4. Your encouragement would be fine if I were confident that I know the things I'm talking about. One who knows the truth about the dearest and most important things can speak with firmness and audacity among smart and dear friends. But to make speeches when one is not confident and is still investigating, as I am doing, is fearful and dangerous. What I fear is not to incur in the charge of being ridiculous, for that would be childish, but if I fall off the truth, I will not fall myself, but draw my friends along regarding things about which it is most important not to be mistaken. About to adrastea for what I'm about to say, for I suppose that to kill someone involuntarily is a lesser crime than to mislead him about fine, good, and just institutions, end of quote. It is only after Glaucon frees Socrates from the potential charges that Socrates begins in earnest his discussion of sexual difference and equality in relation to the task of guarding and ruling the ideal city. I quote Glaucon's words, "Well, Socrates, if we suffer something out of tune from your speech, we'll acquit you from the charges as in a homicide case. You are pure and have not deceived us, but take courage and speak." And Socrates, "I will," I said, "for as the law says, even in the case of involuntary homicide, someone who is acquitted from the charges is pure." Socrates bowing to Adrastea further alludes to the trial, as the goddess Adrastea was commonly associated with the necessary dispensation of rewards and punishment. As in the Apology, in this passage we find combined the theme of comedic laughter and that of the charge of corrupting the youth, brought against Socrates, that is Socrates' fear that is leading astray his friends. Socrates clarifies that for all the jokes of the wits who resist reforms and novelty out of conformism and unreflecting attachment to old habits, what he fears is not to be covered in ridicule. Rather, he fears harming his friends out of his ignorance about the matters at stake. This concern is well placed, for if Socrates' proposal and arguments are wrong, this means that they are violating the principle of specialization that is key both to his definition of justice and to the creation of just city in speech. But I will speak about this later. This would entail misleading his friends on the issue of justice, which is a serious charge indeed. Glaucon reassures Socrates not by claiming that his proposals are certainly correct, but by claiming that they will not bring charges against him, for even if Socrates is wrong, he still will not be deemed guilty of a crime, as his deceiving his friends would be not a voluntary action. One may wonder why Glaucon's reassurance as the possible injured party should be sufficient to reassure Socrates. After all, one can be the victim of a crime without even recognizing to be one. Yet, besides the reference to the Athenian law about involuntary manslaughter, in the Apology, we do find a similar defensive argument. At 33d, 34b, Socrates appeals to the jurors, asking them why, if it is true that he is guilty of corrupting the youth, none of the young men who used to consort with him, and not even their close relatives or fathers, are bringing charges against him, and why, on the contrary, many of them are sitting at the trial among his supporters. So if I'm correct that this section of the Republic is couched in legal language and makes references to Socrates' trial and in fact to the Apology, then it is time to clarify the import of such a reading for the interpretation of Socrates' proposal concerning women's education and activities. First, this apologetic framing makes it, in my view, impossible to read the first and the following waves as ironic, unserious, or hyperbolic. On the contrary, by adopting this legal language and having Socrates refer to the risk of ridicule and laughter, Plato is also warning the reader that these proposals are meant to be taken very seriously despite their anti-conformism. Second, the apologetic frame is also meant to provide a defense of Socrates against possible charges of leading the youth astray with these anti-conformist views. As such, this section of the dialogue should be read together with Plato's response to Aristophanes' comedic caricature of Socrates in the Apology. Contextualization of the first wave within the Socratic debate and analysis of its apologetic framing should be sufficient to show that the first wave is not just expedient and derivative from the abolition of the oikos. Yet there are also conceptual reasons why the reading of the first wave as expedient lest we make Plato's Socrates utterly incoherent. As already mentioned at 553c, Socrates as an unnamed opponent accused him of contradicting himself and violating his own principle of specialization and definition of justice. In the subsequent lines, he sets out to push back against this accusation and demonstrate that there is no contradiction involved. Keeping this in mind, interpretations that implicitly or explicitly make Socrates' argument contradictory with his principle of justice strike me as frankly untenable. Notwithstanding, interpretations that see the first wave as merely expedient do just that. They convey a reading of the first wave that makes it incompatible with the principle of specialization and therefore with justice as defined by Socrates. One interpretation is to claim that the real reasons behind the equal education of women guardians are eugenic. In this sense, then, the specific function of women guardians is in continuity with the traditional and oppressive role attributed to Athenian women in sexual reproduction and children upbringing. It must first be noted that the first wave does not just entail women's education, but their sharing in the very same activities as men, that is, guarding and ruling. At the end of Book 7, Socrates reminds Glaucon, who had forgotten about it, that women with the appropriate natures will be rulers. He says, and ruling women, Glaucon, I said, for you should not think that what I have said applies to men more than to women, at least to those among them who have been born with befitting natures. But even if we were to leave this aside and take it that all education is at stake here, on the eugenic reading, which has been suggested by Catherine Gardner, we would need to accept that after expounding upon the dangers of conferring a philosophical education to unworthy natures, Socrates allows women devoid of the necessary natural talent to receive not just military and musical training, but even the complex training in the various mathematical disciplines and dialectics articulated in Book 7. This simply because Socrates explicitly says that it cannot be in the dialogue. Analogously, the view that takes the first wave to be a consequence of the abolition of the oikos and to be responding to the necessity of giving women guardians something to do once the oikos is eliminated. This is, for example, Dorothea Frede, but also Catherine McGeer, fails to meet the coherence requirements that Socrates sets for himself at the beginning of this discussion. If women guardians once again engage in the activities of ruling or guarding without having the necessary natural predisposition, this would necessarily introduce injustice in the ideal city by violating the principle of specialization. As these readings encounter an array of intractable problems, one may, I cut this part, sorry. And this is a leftover of what I cut. Let me go to my conclusion. The aim of this paper was to demonstrate that the argument of the first wave should be taken as a genuine and serious argument for the abolition of sexual difference insofar as the administration of the city is concerned. The first wave is indeed Plato's reelaboration of the Socratic tenet that men and women have the same virtue, a tenet embraced by Plato's Socrates in the Meno, and that we find also in Xenophon's Socratic writings and in sayings attributed by the tradition to Antisthenes. It is also a reelaboration of the Socratic tenet that women can be taught virtue. As such, the first wave is not logically dependent on the abolition of the oikos, nor is it merely expedient. While much has been left explored, given the limited scope of this article, recontextualizing Plato's intervention within the Socratic debate on women's virtue and reestablishing the plausibility of a straightforward interpretation of the text that takes Socrates' argument at its face value can offer a more fruitful basis for addressing the problems and oddities of the text that remain to be explained. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for a great talk, very fascinating. So now we're gonna go to Fernanda's commentary. Fernanda Israel Pio is a PhD candidate at the graduate program in metaphysics of the University of Brasília. She's also a researcher at the Cátedra UNESCO Archive, an editor of the Archive podcast, and assistant editor of Plato Journal. So, Fernanda, if you will.
All right, thank you, Luiz. I will share my screen so you can understand me better. I wasn't intending to, but I think it would be easier. So there you go. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. Just a second. Okay. First, I would like to send hi to Pedro. I loved him, the cat. Okay. Also Pedro Dotto. First, I would like to compliment the organization of Plato today. It has been a pleasure to join you all as a listener and a true privilege to offer this commentary today. Thank you for having me. Back in February of 2021, we had an event organized by the Archive around the topic of gender and classical studies. We hosted a series of talks, and we had the pleasure to host Arruzza talking about philosopher queens. So it is very special for me to be able to follow along as this topic is developed by you, Arruzza. Okay. In Arruzza's talk, she proposed the hypothesis that the first wave, the one about women with the required natural talent receiving the same education and the same activities as men, is an autonomous argument, that it can stand on its own feet without depending on the hypothesis around the logical argumentative connection with the second wave, like the eugenic argument and the argument about the necessity of giving women something to do after the abolition of the oikos. First, she points out that what should be a Socratic tenet, that a similar position on women's soul is shared more or less by several other Socratics, something along the lines of a philosophical principle about the nature of souls and virtues being the same, shared by men and women. Like, courage is the same courage. It doesn't matter if the courageous one is a man or a woman. The second point is about the apologetic framing of the argument in Republic. She points out the frequency of allusions to the context of law, court, and legal terms in Socrates' manifestations. She states that references to love should not be taken as a flag that indicates unserious speech, but that these elements make it impossible to read the waves as ironic or unserious. She also points out the connection with Plato's response to Aristophanes' comedic caricature of Socrates in the Apology. The last point is about Socrates' principle of specialization, stating that women guardians engaging in activities of ruling and guarding without the necessary natural predisposition should necessarily harm the specialization principle, bringing injustice to the ideal city. In the final part of the talk, we face some problems with Socrates' arguments that could be the reason why the measure of sexual equality proposed in the Republic is often seen as a joke or a method of forced reorganization of women after the abolition of the oikos. Arruzza points out some oddities in the text which make it difficult to take Socrates' arguments as genuine argument in favor of sexual equality. First, the multiple negative commentaries about women in the Republic. Against this oddity, we can observe that Socrates also delivers critiques to other citizens of unjust cities, men and women, and the women portrayed in the guardian class are a whole different type of women because they had the proper education and development of the virtues provided by the just city. Arruzza also brings the argument of the passage when Socrates talk about the inexistent sphere of competence as women as far as the administration of the city is concerned, in a context where it would make more sense to talk about men, not women. Arruzza states that it is plausible to read the first wave in a straightforward way, and that this is a good start for addressing the oddities of the text. Well, Arruzza, I really appreciate your text. I always question why it is so difficult to find people facing this equality argument as something serious, because I really would like to see it being studied and developed, and I'm really glad you're doing it. Actually, I always feel kind of weird with arguments of comedy and seriousness in Plato. Maybe it's just because I'm bad at understanding jokes and spotting sarcasm. Okay, I would like to point out the work of Rosane Maia, that recently finished her thesis around this topic of women in the Republic, and say that her text and work in our study group certainly inspired my ideas around this topic and the questions I will present today. I tried to make my questions in the text form, but I'll just say them. The first one is something like formal, maybe, and that is about the terms we use to talk about sexual difference. I would like to make sure that we are talking roughly about the same thing. In your presentation back in 2021, we talked about two types of natural differences that you could spot at the time about Socrates in the Republic. One about the natural differences in the body, and the other one in the soul. And here I would like to make reference to Olivier Renaud that talked yesterday. The text on Coimbra Companion about Plato and gender, because he talks about the gender narrative being related to a political agenda and the topic of similarities and differences being addressed accordingly to the necessity of the construction of the ideal city. I tend to agree with him when we talk about sexual equality in the Republic. I feel like adding something to denote the partiality of this equality, like I did before when I was talking about a measure of equality. And I'm not even talking about the issue of other classes not having this equality, but about the equality observed within the guardian class. Do you think that this makes sense, or would you say that this equality is whole, at least in the soul? And of course, I'm talking about the Republic. Some passages like the transmigration of the souls in the myth of air make me think about this possibility. Okay, and the second point, it's about this sex and gender theoretical division or indivisibility. Do you think that we could say that Plato identifies a cultural aspect of what we could call sex? And here I make reference to the breaking with the radical separation between nature and nomos. I feel like Plato performs a similar movement as the one we historically had in feminism and gender studies, of highlighting the nomos within what one would call purely natural. And in the same way that we have repercussions of this maneuver in gender studies, we also see repercussions of this in the Republic. So those are my questions and suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. These were really great questions. Shall I respond to the questions now? Okay.
Yes, please.
Okay, so on the issue of equality, I thought a lot about this because I was trying to understand this reference that we find that is introduced first by Glaucon to the weakness of women compared to comparative weakness of women. So to what does this refer? In the end, I persuaded myself that what is at stake there is really bodily strength and weakness and nothing else. So in other words, that it is what Socrates has when Socrates accepts Glaucon's point about his cues, what he has in mind is bodily strength. And so when he speaks about giving lighter task to guardian women, he's speaking about tasks that require a lesser degree of bodily strength. So from this viewpoint, I would say that when the soul is concerned, Plato actually provides, at least Plato-Socrates provides an argument that is more radical than Xenophon's argument in the Economicus, because in the Economicus, we do find still a difference in the soul in the sense of, it is always a comparative difference, never a difference in kind, but it is a comparative difference in how much women are predisposed, naturally predisposed to courage. I couldn't find this in the Republic. So in other words, in the argument, in fact, it would seem that when the soul is concerned, women and men have exactly the same kind of natural predispositions. Of course, these are different according to different classes of people, but they're not different according to sex. So there is not even a comparative difference in terms of natural inclination, for example, to courage. This is quite remarkable because Andrea was clearly the virtue that was not attributed to women. I mean, the term itself speaks of its manliness, and in fact, with the except of the Socratics, usually when there is a mention of women's courage, the word Andrea is never used. Taros is used, other kinds of words that indicate more some kind of, irreflective boldness rather than courage as a virtue. So it is quite remarkable that here, Plato-Socrates seems not to make any distinction and basically to want to say that the soul doesn't have a sex. And this is suggested also by the myth of air. This leads me to say something about mind-body dualism, to go back to Gabriele's talk. Of course, mind-body dualism is bad and so on, to an extent. So in other words, I'm working now on a book manuscript on this topic, on women in the Socratic circle and Plato's dialogues. And why I do agree that, we shouldn't attribute strong dualism to Plato. I completely agree with this. But the argument I'm making is also that from a historical viewpoint, the identification of the soul as a distinct entity, which has its own nature, its own properties, distinct from the body, the properties of the body, made it possible for these Socratic thinkers to think that then women have the same nature, that women can acquire the same virtues and so on. This was a rather revolutionary position to take, because the position defended by Meno in the Meno, that was the dominant position, was basically what popular morality thought, that obviously the sophrosune of a woman is not the same as the sophrosune of a man, because the sophrosune of a woman, as Aristotle defends, is obedience, submission. So the identification of the soul as this distinct entity, not reducible to the body, and invisible, so not you cannot really see it in the social status, reflected in social status or wealth or external goods. It made it possible to take these rather radical anti-conformist positions about women. And so I would like to amend, let's say, the feminist critique of mind-body dualism by defending a bit the invention of the soul from this viewpoint. On the issue of, on the second question, which is really excellent, because in fact, for the way it is framed, it is a very, very good way of framing it. Yes, I totally agree, precisely for the reason why I was explaining that Plato is indeed distinguishing between what people believe belongs to women's nature on the basis of custom, habituation, and so on. So cultural aspects, let's say, or the cultural construction of womanhood, and women's real nature, which is their soul. So of course, in this sense, the argument is not exactly the same as the feminist distinction between gender and sex, but there is, in a sense, the idea of denaturalizing what is considered to be womanhood by showing that in fact it is the outcome of conventions, nomoi, and education, and that nomoi and conventions can be in contradiction or in tension with nature, with physis. And so the goal of the ideal city is basically to then harmonize physis and nomos.
Well, okay, so we have many interesting topics already here in the discussion. So now I would like to invite everyone, if there are any questions, to do as Antonio and raise your hands. Antonio, please.
Thank you, Professor Arruzza. This was very interesting. I have just a sort of a curiosity. I don't know if you can answer this, but it's this idea that Socrates was trying to disgender the concept of virtue is very interesting. I'm sorry, the concept of Andrea specifically is very interesting, given the etymological origin of the word is like the sort of the virtue of man specifically. And I would like to ask you about the success of this move historically. Was it picked up by philosophers in the later tradition? You mentioned that Aristotle doesn't agree with him, right? And just a related point to this, as reading Plato, I would, of course, want him to be a feminist. I know that's a very strong word to attribute to a Greek philosopher, but also concerning the reaction of Socrates' reaction to the second wave, I think something that is remarkable is that he seems himself to be very concerned about the ridicule that he could invite by defending such a position, in a way that he doesn't seem to be so afraid of this ridicule while defending other very radical positions about the reform in the city, right? And so I think it's interesting also to see how even if he's being driven by logos in this instance, like he's sort of being forced by logos to defend this position, even if he himself still seems to be afraid of the ridicule and perhaps in some way still feel that he's defending something that might be considered ridiculous then, right? And he shows himself to be afraid of misleading Glaucon and Adimantus on this point. Well, he doesn't seem so afraid in other aspects. So maybe this also shows the tentativeness of what Plato is doing. But thank you very much again for.
Okay, so on the last question, I do think that the references to the ridicules are there because of Aristophanes' comedy Assembly Women, which I take, I mean, the way in which I see the chronology working and so on, I take the Assembly Women to have been performed before Plato wrote the Republic. And so it may be or not be that Aristophanes, there is, some hypothesis that Aristophanes may have heard Plato's lectures in the academy on the topic and then ridiculized them. We don't have any evidence for this. It may also be that Aristophanes made this up and Plato picked it up, but twisting, giving it a completely different twist that is taking it seriously. But clearly the reason why Socrates is insisting on the fear of being ridiculed is because of some evident similarities between his proposals and Assembly Women, especially the abolition of the oikos and so on. But what I want, and let's say some readers have taken these references to the Assembly Women as evidence that then the Socrates means us not to take these arrangements seriously. But with my discussion about the legal language, what I wanted to show is that yes, I agree that there is clearly a reference to the assembly women and to the fact that Aristophanes made fun of this idea, these ideas in the assembly women. But there is also a warning that Aristophanes was wrong, because there is, let's say, in a sense, a reference back to the apology and the effect. So unless we are available to accept that Plato somehow agreed with Aristophanes' characterization of Socrates in the clouds, I don't see why we have to think that Plato agrees with Aristophanes' characterization of these policies. For me, it really makes little sense. On the contrary, I think that the reference to Aristophanes is apologetic, in the same way in which we have an apologetic reference to Aristophanes in the Apology. On the issue of the gender in the concept of Andrea, well, Aristophanes really reacts against the Socratics. He takes a very explicit position, which is a conservative position against the thesis that he attributes to the Socrates, and so on, by defending the fact that obviously virtue depends on social function and social status, and therefore the virtue of a slave is different from the virtue of a woman, and the virtue of a son is different from the virtue of a man, and so on and so on. I would say probably I mean, we don't have the text, but I can imagine that the cynics may have also radicalized the Socratic position. There are good reasons, but once again, you know, textual evidence is difficult to find, but there are good reasons to think that similarly, let's say that the certain theory of gender equality, sexual equality was also present in the Stoic and Epicurean schools. So I do think that Aristotle represents a distinctly reactionary view, let's say, on this, in at least in the classical Hellenistic period, on this subject. The final thing, I don't consider Plato feminist. So I'm interested in my book in reconstructing the Socratic debate on women, showing how it is linked to the issue of the soul and the discussion of virtue, and therefore to the process of internalization of virtue. And, you know, rejecting readings of Plato's, readings of these claims in Plato's dialogues as unserious or as expedient and so on. No, I think these were real tenets that Plato did share with other Socratics. I didn't mention Aeschines, but, you know, like there are good reasons to think that Aeschines' Aspasia was also based on the Socratic tenet that virtue is the same for men and women. However, I do not think that this is a feminist claim. And this has to do with what I take feminism to be, which requires the collective agency and voice of women, which was not present in the classical period. And so what we are dealing with is male philosophers making claims, some sympathetic claims about women, claims that then in the history of feminist thought did play a significant role, because, you know, there are some similarities between Plato's arguments and emancipationist arguments in first wave feminism. But I don't take Plato himself to be a feminist, and for this reason, I do agree that there are some oddities in the arguments. You know, Juliana's famous criticism, it doesn't seem to be really concerned with women's rights. Yes, it is not really concerned. It is concerned with the beautiful city, and this is the main point. It's not concerned with women's rights per se or women's liberation. But this doesn't mean that then his argument is not an argument that actually does present a version of sexual equality and so on, and therefore it's quite interesting for us.
Pedro?
Yeah, thank you very much, Cinzia, for the wonderful presentation. I'd like to ask you about Aeschines. Do you know if Aeschines had something on the nature of women, the role of women in achieving virtue and so on, if there is anything on asking us in this regard. And also if you could speak a little bit more, we would invite you to address how this presentation of today is connected to your general project in your book. If you could situate the current presentation in your book project on the nature and the virtue of women in the Socratic circle and so on. Thank you.
Okay, so we don't have explicit claims concerning women's nature, but in the Aspecia, at least based on the reconstruction, we can come up with, based on the few fragments we have. Socrates makes probably Callias, who is the Socrates interlocutor in the okay, let me restart. Socrates suggests to Callias to send his son to study with Aspecia, and Aspecia will teach him political art and rhetoric. Callias probably was scandalized by this proposal. We don't have the fragment, but we do have the fragment with Socrates' response. And in his responses, Socrates makes the point that he picks up some notable examples of women who displayed courage and the ability to command. So, for example, the Queen Rodogune and so on. And moreover, when speaking about Aspecia, he insists that in fact it is Aspecia who taught Gorgian rhetoric to Pericles, and to further make the point that it is thanks to Aspecia that Pericles refined his oratory skills. He says that Aspecia also managed to transform Lysicles, an unknown ship handler, into one of the most prominent politicians, thanks to her teachings. So Dietmar, in his interpretation of Aeschines Aspecia, suggested, and I agree with this, that these arguments are probably are based on the underlying tenet that virtue is the same for men and women, that women's nature is not different in terms of their ability to acquire virtue from men's nature, because this must be the case, because if we are talking, if he's making the point that it is not absurd to be taught political virtue by a woman, by Aspecia, and then bringing up examples of queenly women and courageous military women, the logical presupposition seems to be indeed that women clearly have the ability to such a nature that enables them to become queen, military commanders, teachers of rhetoric, and so on. On the issue of the book, so in the book I have basically, I want to situate Plato's dialogues within the Socratic debate. I think this is important in order to avoid misreadings of Plato, of what Plato is doing in the dialogues, that do not take into account the fact that these people were debating with each other around the same topics, and there are some similarities in the arguments. And so we cannot really give an interpretation of Plato's claims in the Republic that is completely at odds and has nothing to do with this Socratic debate, if we want to give an historical reconstruction of the text. So the first two chapters are on the other Socratics. I focus on Aeschines, Antisthenes, and Xenophon. The first chapter is on virtue, and the second on marriage. And then the rest of the chapters are on Plato's dialogues. So I will address Diotima and Aspecia, in Symposium and Menexenus. I will have a chapter, maybe two, on the Republic, depending on how it goes. One chapter on the laws, obviously, book 7. And then I will have to address the Timaeus problem, on which I have nothing to say at the moment, because I don't know how to solve this problem, because in the Timaeus we find this idea of transmigration of the souls, where women are basically bad male souls embodied in a female body. This doesn't square very easily, in my view, with the Republic and the laws. And I don't have a solution at the moment, so I really cannot say anything besides that there is a big problem there I need to address. And then the final chapter is going to be on the feminist debate on Plato, in which I will probably take a the Beauvoirian position, in the sense saying, at least historically speaking, the notion of transcendence has not been always so bad. In fact, the idea that there is something in the person that transcends what you can see in the body, which means sexual difference, but also like the visible markers of social status. Well, it's a moment of freedom, in my view, in Western thought. So I'm going to take this controversial position. Of course, not in order to endorse man-body dualism today, or to think that we do have a soul, immortal soul, and so on. I don't, but because I'm not very enthusiastic about, let's say, univocal interpretation of the history of Western philosophy that sees, like the origin of all evils in the notion of the soul, mind-body dualism, and so on. I think it's much more complicated than this.
I believe next is John.
Thank you. So I came in a bit late, so I apologize if I'm asking you to repeat yourself. But my question is about some comments you made about the lighter tasks argument, and how you understood the weakness as bodily rather than psychic. So I was just wondering, it seems like an implication of taking that as restricted to the body is that the distributing jobs alike will only apply to certain types of jobs. So there will still be some jobs that women are excluded from. They mention hoplite, serving as a hoplite, as one of the things they're concerned about in the early part of the argument. So it seems like if you take it as weakness of the body, then women will still be excluded from those kinds of jobs, as opposed to taking the lighter tasks argument as internal to any sort of craft or art. There's a distribution of tasks, and women will be given whatever the lighter tasks means. But it seemed like you were taking it as still within the division of labor. There are some jobs like serving as a hoplite that women will be excluded from on the basis of their bodily weakness. Is that I'm just curious if is that right? Is that what you think? What do you think about that sort of implication or those ideas?
Yeah. No, I haven't thought about this. I don't think they will necessarily be excluded from hoplitic warfare. They could wear lighter armors, for example, a lighter shield and so on. So it is not that clear that it is necessarily an exclusion. There may be like very heavily demanding tasks, I don't know, like digging trenches or things like this kind, on which maybe, women will be allotted something a bit lighter to do. But it seems to be not very consequential. So in other words, and I'm saying this because in book 7, after discussing all the educational curriculum and so on, Socrates is not reintroducing this issue of excuse again. He's saying, and everything that I said applies to women guardians too, at least those who have the nature. And this is what really matters. Like women will receive exactly the same training, which is also military training, but they will be trained in mathematics, in arithmetics, and then the ones who talent in dialectics and so on and so on. And this is really what matters. Whether they will dig holes or not is really not the issue here. Certainly the issue of bodily weakness doesn't grant the exclusion from military duties. This, I think, we cannot read the text in this way, because he insists on the fact that they will receive military training, and also in the laws, where in fact we have a bit of a less radical position in terms of the policies suggested. Still, there is the insistence that women really need to be military trained so as to be able to defend the city. And so the reference to bodily weakness cannot mean exclusion from military duty, but, like, wearing, lighter weapons, it's a possibility, a lighter shield, being more, used as archers, etc., etc. I mean, all possible things, but in any case, I take it from the text that it would not be differences that grant any hierarchy, let's say, internal, based on sex among the guardians.
Carolina?
Thank you very much for all this. I'm very interested in this topic, but I would like, it's a clarification question. I'd like to understand a little bit better what's your understanding about justice in the Republic, because if I understood your claim correctly, you understand that Book 5 is based on the concept of justice, and Socrates is making this claim, and I completely agree with this part. But when you say that justice is the principle of specialization, I have some difficulties there, because it seems that if you claim that the reason for the equality is a specialization, you're assuming you're assuming the position that the objector is doing to Socrates, saying, okay, but it's to do your own nature. And then you have the kind of solution we find in Xenophon, which is the complementary thesis, right? So women will do their specialization at home, and that's the way it goes. So it doesn't follow from the principle of specialization that women should do their tasks. So we need, I think the good side of this, if I can say, is that we don't, the principle of specialization is said in Book 4, is explicitly said not to be justice, and just to be clearly in the soul. And then we have a different take of this. So could you just develop for me how do you see this this connection between justice and argument? Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I mean, in Book 4 we have two descriptions of justice. One is political justice. Each class does its own work and doesn't meddle in the business of the other classes. And then we have the psychic justice. Each part of the soul does its own job in such a way that then the soul is completely harmonized. So the principle of specialization means that you are in the city, you are allotted to the tasks that correspond to your own nature. So there must be a correspondence between your natural vocation, so what you are naturally predisposed to do, and what you are going to do in the city. And so people who do not have a natural predisposition to philosophy should not engage in philosophy at all. I should stay actually as far away as possible from dialectics, because then it becomes dangerous. And at the same, people who do not have a natural predisposition to courage should not be placed in position of guarding the city or doing so. This is what I mean by, or what in the English literature is meant by principle of specialization. So the idea that each member of the city should be allotted to the task or to the jobs that are coherent with their own nature. And so I do think that the argument for women's participation in the guardian class is based on the principle of specialization, because the logic is precisely that they have the same nature. When it comes to guarding the city, men and women have the same nature because they both have a soul, and the soul doesn't have a sexual difference. And this is what matters when it comes to guarding the city or ruling the city. And so in order to be coherent with the criterion of justice, one cannot exclude women from who are skilled, who are potentially skilled, who have a natural vocation for it. One cannot exclude them from government or from guarding the city. This would violate the principle of specialization in the sense in which I explained today. That is, it would mean a lot in women who have a philosophical nature and natural vocation to dialectics to, let's say, farm. This cannot be on Socrates' own definition of justice. And but yeah,
just a follow-up. So so does it mean that when you say this is about justice, it's not justice as it is defined in book 4 as justice in the soul? It's not that.
No, it is also that, because in order
like the timos and the rationality and desire. Does it have to do with your desire, your timos, and your rationality,
yes, of course,
or it has to do with your?
Yeah, it has to do with both, because of course, I mean, the problem. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, of course, because the problem is that if I am a philosophical nature, but I'm excluded from philosophy and forced to farm or make clothes and so on, this will cause a disharmony to my soul, because it would not provide me with the necessary conditions for my strong rational part of the soul to flourish, and therefore to govern harmoniously the rest of the soul. And the same with Thumos. If I'm a spirited person, but I'm not allowed to guard, then spirit can go wrong, instead of receiving the proper education and harmonize well with the rest of the soul, it can, then I could become, I don't know, like a nasty, like Socrates' wife, who is unfortunately disparaged in Socratic texts, like, very hard character, difficult to swallow and so on. So I think it is really both. It is just for the city, but also for the individual, because only in this way, the individual women will be able to, will be given the conditions to actually flourish, to have a harmony of the soul, obviously to different degrees, because clearly, philosopher queens will be the perfectly harmonious ones. The other ones will need the guidance of the philosophers, but still, the logic of the Republic is that the justice of the soul and justice of the city necessarily need to go together. And it is, in fact, by creating a certain kinds of social arrangements and placing people in different functions according to their natural vocation that one makes sure that they will also be harmonious within their soul.
Thank you.
Flora?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor. It was really insightful. So I have two connected questions. The first one is on your reading of the obsolescence of the oikos, because I was wondering, I think the insights of the discussion of women are really useful to provide, I don't know, solutions to the problem of public and private spaces. And so I couldn't grasp what your reading was. I assumed that you were saying that it was a lesser, it was a weak interpretation just to say that women should have something to do because of the obsolescence of the oikos. So I was wondering what your reading is in this topic. And the other thing is that I think it is Wendy Brown who draws a comparison between the several roles of women in the Platonic corpus and the social position of philosophers, meaning that both women and philosophers are bound to the private spaces. So the issue with Plato was to force a publicization of both the philosophers and women. So I really like this reading. I was wondering what you think about it, but mostly, would that be a question that could be attributed to the wider Socratic circle, or would that be attributed to a Plato idea? That's both of the questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay, on the issue of public and private, so the interpretation I was challenging is basically claims that what interests really Plato is to abolish the oikos, because the oikos is dangerous for the ideal city. But then once he abolishes the oikos, he has the problem of having women, or giving women something to do, given that in the division of the public and private sphere in Greek societies, women belong to the private sphere, and their proper job was to take care of the household, the children, and so on. And so the thesis in McGeer, I think, is that women cannot be like, since they will not be in charge of raising children anymore, and there are no private houses anymore, then they cannot stay idle, because this would be a problem for the city. And for this reason, then in the first wave, Socrates proposes that they should be trained as equally as men, and so on. And my objections to this is that once again, it cannot be like this. Makes the argument really incoherent, because it means that you are giving to women something to do for which they have no natural vocation. So unless we take really seriously the argument in the first wave about natural equality, the argument is incoherent. And I don't see the point of making it incoherent, given that I don't think that, I don't see the necessity for it, let's say, or besides, not being a very charitable reading, but also like why? Especially because Socrates prefaces the whole discussion by wondering whether he's being incoherent and responding that he's not. He makes this explicit. Am I contradicting? Because he invents this heristical opponent who says, you're violating your principle of justice, your definition of justice, that everybody should do their proper jobs. And he explained, no, actually, I'm not. I'm saying precisely on the basis of this principle. So I find readings that completely neglect all of this. I don't know. And I think, once again, I think one of the reasons, and this was the part I didn't include in the paper because it was too long, I can understand the reason why some interpreters went in this direction, in the sense that, of course, if you read the text by expecting a feminist argument, you will not find one. And so you will find all sorts of oddities from a feminist viewpoint, statements about disparaging statements about women in the first books of the Republic. But if you don't take this as a feminist argument, but as a philosophical argument about the soul, which is what is at stake, then I think you can explain the oddities in different ways, and you can accept that indeed in the text Socrates is saying, from the viewpoint of the soul, there is no difference. Point. Like he's saying this. So on the issue of the public and private sphere, now this is actually very nice, a very good insight. Yes, I think this is in the Republic, obviously. This is what Plato is doing in the Republic and is not doing in other dialogues. And of course, it has to do with the fact that in the Republic is at least exploring the possibility of a city governed by philosophers, that is a city that is as the perfect instantiation of justice, as perfect as a city can be, because even Callipolis is not perfect. In fact, it will fall. And I agree that in this text, yes, it does bring into the open arena both the philosopher and women. And this is difficult in both cases to do. And in fact, in the laws, the Athenian says quite explicitly that it is difficult to bring women into the public sphere because women will resist, because they are, they tend to be seclusive, let's say. Yeah, so I agree. I think that I mean, and of course, you know, in the Republic, what is happening is that basically there is no, at least for the guard, there is no private sphere anymore. So in other words, the city becomes an oikos, where everything is transparent except the lies. So in other words, there are no public dwellings, there are no walls, there is no private property. Everybody will be able to go in and out of everything, and people will be naked. A lot of time training. So it's complete exposure.
Just a follow-up, just because in contrast, the tyrant, because it's your book also, but the tyrant, the tyrant is described as living a womanly life because he can't go out of the house. So the private and the public is also there, but in reverse.
Yeah, because so I think one of the problems, I mean, because there are various comments of this kind in the Republic about women and so on. Usually, although I mean, I'm always hesitant about it, but usually Plato is not using the term fuses in these passages. And I think one has to make a difference between his comments on, you know, or Socrates' comments on women as they are, because socially, culturally shaped in a certain way, and clearly there is a dislike, an association of women with appetites, with, you know, like all the discussion of poetry, you know. But you know, we need to distinguish, let's say, the judgment on the concrete Athenian women he deals with, which are the outcome of bad education and so on, and the question of what constitutes women's nature. And I think in Socrates' work, and this is also another proof that, you know, this is not exactly a feminist argument, because it's very ready to disparage, you know, concrete existing women. But at the same time, he wants to say, okay, but this is the outcome of bad political arrangements. This is what you end up with by keeping the women at home.
Just on the second question of the wider Socratic circle, would you say that they would be interested in this theme of public and private spheres, or no?
Okay, so this is complicated, because the problem is that we don't, except for Xenophon, we don't really have the text. We have fragments, best case scenario, testimonies. Xenophon, I think, at least in the Economicus, he wants to maintain the separation of public and private spheres. But he wants to say that the virtues required to govern both spheres are the same. And so the household head, let's say the woman in the household, will also exercise queenly art, so the art of command. It's the same art, but it is applied to the oikos rather than to the city. And the oikos is presented as it was, that is, as the what makes it possible for men to be in the outside world. So insofar as the woman takes care, the wife takes care of the management of the household, so social reproduction, then the man can be, and this is why I stand and in good shape, can go around and so on. So in Xenophon, at least in the Economicus, clearly there is where we have the normative thesis, because it is the God's order. Clearly we have a theory of he maintains some sexual difference and a theory of complementarity in the public-private sphere. At the same time, in historical writings, we do find a lot of ruling women, or women who exercise a political role or even military role, and to whom he seems to be sympathetic. They're never, Greek women, but so it is complicated. It's not necessarily. And for Antisthenes, we absolutely have no idea. And Aeschines, we don't know. I mean, it's possible that, because he makes these examples of women who became queens, Rodogune, Targelia, who even were the military commands. So it is possible that he actually may have shared in the idea that this separation, you know, of tasks between household and political rule should be overcome. But the problem is that we cannot say because we don't have the evidence for claiming this. But let's say at the very least, he makes the case that Aspasia is an excellent teacher of political art. That's already like a big claim.
Thank you so much.
So I believe we have to wrap it up because we're past the time. So thank you everyone, especially Gabriele, Cinzia, George, and Fernanda. It was really a great session, great discussions. And I would like to invite everyone to our next sessions at 2 p.m. today. We're gonna have table 4 with Andrea Nightingale. She's gonna present the talk, Who Are We, Where Are We? Plato's Narratives of the Soul. And Angie Hobbs, presenting Platonic Proportions, Beauty, Harmony, and the Good Life. And then tomorrow, there is going to be no morning session, just a table at afternoon, 2 p.m. as well, with Jessica Moss presenting Philosophical Dogs, Plato on Knowledge and Familiarity, and Marcos Engano with Troublemakers. So I hope to see you all in the next sessions, and thank you very much once again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.